None of this could happen without gifts, giving, and people giving in so many different ways. And Rafael Chacon has served the museum well, and we've tapped his expertise so much over the years. And he served on the collection committee for 3 years, and he's served on the historic preservation committee within the community. And so when we endeavored to, on this building project, there was a great deal of passion about the Carnegie building. And where I'm standing right now, this is where Edgar Paxson, this was his library, this was Norman McLean's library. We walked through these doors. And this was A.J. Gibson's library. And so that history gives us a great deal of passion, appreciation for how to respect the past and also preserve it and prepare for the future. This is no longer a library, but it's a learning institution. And how do we bridge the function of a library to the function of a museum? The expertise of Rafael in this whole process kept our focus on appreciating this structure, this building, educating us about A.J. Gibson, and we would be remiss not to visit this subject and to tap this brilliant scholar that we have in our midst. And so I'm going to turn this over to you and just thank you for all your giving to this institution.
Thank you. Save that applause. You may hate this lecture. It really is a pleasure to be here. I've been here a couple times this week, and it is just remarkable to see not only how this beautiful building has come into fruition and this institution has come into maturity, but to see how this city and this town has embraced this Missoula Art Museum. I think we all deserve to give each other a huge round of applause. So I just want to start by telling you that I'm going to be lecturing from back here, and you don't need to look at me. What you need to do is look at the screen in front of you. So I'm sorry for doing that, but I want to see what I'm talking about myself. So I'll be lecturing from behind the room, and I want to start by talking about what I'm doing in this lecture. I'm here to represent two issues. The first, of course, is historic preservation as a theme, and of course, a huge portion of what has taken place here in the reopening of the rededication of this museum is historic preservation. And so most of my comments are going to be restricted to this building and its history and the preservation of this building. And secondly, I'm also here to introduce to some of you the life of A.J. Gibson, an architect that I think all of us in this town need to know about. So I'm representing these two entities. And right off the bat, I want to give two caveats. One is that I do have a book in the works on A.J. Gibson. It's not ready. It is not yet in print. And I'm taking no questions on that book from now on, okay? So the second one is that, well, what was my second caveat? Oh, that I'm going to restrict my comments to talking about A.J. Gibson's building, the old Carnegie Library, the building that we're standing in. I'm really not going to talk very much about the addition, but I know that the first question from the floor is going to be, how do you feel about this addition and what it's doing to the Gibson building? And so that's where I want to start. Let me just say that I think that this addition is superb. And I think that A.J. Gibson would be very proud of the work that's been done here. And so my hat is off to the architectural team, to the designer Warren Hampton, to the staff, and to this community that works so hard to maintain the integrity of this historic structure that is on the National Register, and to build an addition that in many, many ways is compatible, that lovingly embraces this old building. And just to add one more comment to that, if you look around this town, you will see plenty of examples of horrible additions to historic buildings. Additions that in so many ways mar the integrity of those historic structures. And I would like to invite you to compare how this building, in fact, does the very opposite of that. There are some in the historic preservation community, both here and elsewhere, who are in some ways purists about historic preservation. That is that every square inch of the old building needed to be preserved. And that was virtually impossible to do with a building like this, for many, many practical reasons. The first of which was that this building was built in 1902 to 1903, and that it's a building that just wouldn't meet code in 2006. I think we discovered as the building was being demolished or taken apart in interior that the joists of the old building were literally sitting on the ground. Well, one could do that in 1900. I don't think you could get away building a building like this today using those kinds of methods. So for many, many reasons, this building is not the ideal historic preservation project because we didn't preserve 100% of that historic fabric. But again, this building is, but the way that this project has been done is a model and will be a model for the way we treat historic buildings, the way we update those buildings and bring them into the 21st century so that they will in fact have a life beyond us for another century, another 2 centuries, if that. So again, my hat is off to the museum for the way this process has been done in respecting the integrity of this historic structure. Okay, so those are the 2 caveats, the 2 opening words, and now let's turn to A.J. Gibson's Carnegie Library for Missoula. I'm going to start by giving you a brief biography of A.J. Gibson's because I know that some of you know Gibson well as Missoula's most important architect in its early years, but many of you do not know who A.J. Gibson was and what he has meant to this city. He is one of our founding fathers, so to speak, one of the pioneers of this town, and I think we owe an enormous debt to A.J. Gibson for not only his architectural vision, but his urban vision for the city. Missoula would not be the lovely, beautiful Intermountain city that it is without having had Gibson here 100 years ago. So here's a little bit of his biography. He was born in Ashland County, Ohio, near the town of Savannah, Ohio, in 1862. And he came to Butte at the age of 17, around 1883 or so, as a young man coming west, as following other people who came in a large migration to the Intermountain West from the Midwestern states. The remarkable thing about A.J. Gibson, and I think most of you who know anything about Gibson will know this, is that he was untrained. But as a young man, he was known to have been very crafty in his design sensibilities and his abilities to put together a building. So that's really what we know, although we suspect that he didn't have anything but a 6th grade education. He was an untrained architect, and that's part of what makes him a really remarkable individual. In January 30th, 1889, he married Maud Lockley, who was a bon vivant, a socialite, a wonderful personality in her own right, in Butte, Montana, where he initially worked for about 5 years. And then in 1890, the year of statehood, Gibson and Maud came to Missoula. And it was then that he began his practice as a contractor, and then slowly worked his way into the profession of designing buildings and architecture. This was an age when anyone could call himself an architect, provided that you had the skills and the chutzpah to pull it off. Gibson simply called himself an architect, a designer architect, designer contractor, although he wasn't formally trained as such. But in the 1890s, he very quickly, in almost meteoric fashion, became Missoula's prominent architect, and subsequently, by 1900, was the acknowledged best architect in western Montana and in northern Idaho. And then his career ended in 1908, shortly before the completion of the courthouse downtown, the project that broke his career and also in some ways forced him into retirement. But then he had a fabulous retirement, a long period when he got to do everything he loved, including not only designing buildings, which he did on an ad hoc basis, but also motoring. He was one of Montana's motoring pioneers, automotive pioneers. He owned the third automobile in the city of Missoula and the first functional automobile in the city of Missoula. And subsequently, he and Maud went on to establish many automotive records in this part of the world. First Montanans to drive across the Mexican border. First Montanans to drive across the Canadian border. First Montanans to drive to California. First Montanans to drive to New York City, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, we won't tarry on that subject, but they did have a marvelous life after his retirement from the practice. And then on December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1927, both he and Maud were tragically killed in an automotive railroad accident. So that's the life of the Gibsons, or AJ, in a nutshell, and nothing is better than a picture. And so I'm going to give you a number of pictures of that fabulous life. And by the way, most of these photos are Maud's photos. She was an accomplished photographer, and Missoula, in various collections, owns most of her photographs. This is AJ in the Rattlesnake in the 1890s, the young architect in his hometown. This is an image of Maud, who is the second woman on the right holding that large camera on her lap. That's AJ's wife, Maud Lockley, and the Camera Club. And there were a number of these amateur camera clubs in Missoula in the 1890s. This is the pack of people that she ran around with in town shooting photographs, shooting huge portions of the state. Maud documented AJ's career and his constructions. So we have many of her photographs of the buildings as they were going up in this part of the world. The old man you see there in front of the window is McKay, the revered Missoula photographer from the turn of the century, the last century. And this is the Gibson and Lockley families. That's AJ on the right nearest the bicycle. And in the foreground in the white dress is Maud. And then Maud's family is behind her. Her mother sitting to her left, her brother Fred, who became a newspaperman on the West Coast, and father Frederick Lockley, who was a Civil War general and the editor of the Intermountain newspaper in Butte. The woman in the back is Maud's eldest sister Gertie, who was married to Joseph Sherburne, the Indian agent up in Browning in Glacier. So this was a prominent family that AJ married into when he married Maud in 1889. And then these are views of Maud and AJ in their earliest years. That's the couple there on the left with a child that they raised and a baby. They did not adopt this child, but they did indeed raise him. The father of this child, incidentally enough, was the man who ran the power plant and inaugurated the Milltown Dam. But anyway, there are the Gibsons on the left with the home that they built in around 1891. And there you see how that house evolved in a series of additions, and that is the house as it stands today in its final permutation on the lower right. That house is still there today on 402nd South 2nd Street in the way, shape, and form that A.J. Gibson gave to it in 1915. And there is the family around 1903, the year that the Carnegie Library opened. And there are some scenes of the Gibsons in the retirement. There's AJ in his garden on the left, the upper left, a picture of them in their touring car down on the Mexican border. I think that says, on the boundary line, U.S. and Mexico. And there's a picture of them at the McLean, and this is the Reverend John McLean, Norman McLean's father's camp. They were good friends. Reverend John McLean was their minister at the Presbyterian Church. And this is Gibson asleep, and I think Maud pulled this little prank on him. The little note with the house doodled on it says, A.J. Gibson, architect, misspelled. But anyway, that's at the McLean camp in up the Blackfoot. And I wanted to, before we actually discuss this building, and I do have, by the way, some prepared notes about the Carnegie Library, I wanted to show you some of the things that Gibson had achieved prior to the construction of this building in 1903. The building that you see there on the upper right is the first, actually it's the second St. Patrick's Hospital. The first St. Patrick's Hospital was a renovated chicken coop. So how's that for historic preservation? But anyway, this was the first St. Patrick's Hospital, which for many, many years was attributed to A.J. Gibson. And we now know that it was not designed by A.J. Gibson. It was designed by an architect by the name of Edward Blanchett. Gibson was the contractor. At this point, he wasn't designing buildings, he was building buildings. But not long after this, and because this building was, at the time, in 1889, the most up-to-date hospital in the state of Montana, because this was so celebrated, Gibson went on to design and build a number of other major hospitals in the state, in Great Falls, as well as northern Idaho, as you see here, Providence Hospital in Wallace. And actually, I don't know if you knew this, but Kate Sutherland, who's been so intimately involved with this project, was born at Providence Hospital in Wallace, Idaho. Anyway, both of these structures are now gone. And then Gibson also built many buildings in our downtown. In fact, if you were to take a walk north, starting actually south of the river, walking north along Higgins Avenue, it's almost as if every other building from here all the way to the X's were the work of A.J. Gibson. So in some ways, when I said earlier that Gibson is not only responsible for bringing the latest architecture, the most up-to-date architecture to this part of the world, he was also in some ways bringing the most up-to-date notion of urbanism to this world. When he started off in Missoula, Missoula was a dusty western town with wooden sidewalks and muddy roads, and most of the buildings in the downtown were made of wood and stick and log. By the time he left it, it was a full-blown, modern, civilized place with paved roads, streetcars, stone and brick, lofty buildings like the Gibson Block that you see here. When he built this building when he proposed to build this building in 1893, Western Montana was in a terrible economic slump. And people said, you are a fool to buy any land in this spot. And he had the vision of building himself a building which eventually became his offices, but it was also an investment for Gibson. And so you see the building as it looked when it was first built in the upper right, and then you see it as it was remodeled in 1910, in 1911. That was the famous Gibson Block. It is no longer there. There's a big pile of red bricks there today. And anyway, I don't know if you recognize where that building is. There is the Gibson Block on the left, and you recognize this corner? This is, of course, the crossing of Broadway and Higgins, which is, of course, the heart, the nexus upon which Missoula turns. Gibson had the foresight in 1893, in the middle of an economic depression, to recognize that that was going to be the heart of the modern city of Missoula, and indeed it still is today. And there you see the Gibson Block on the left, and there you see some of the buildings that grew up around the Gibson Block not long after his building went up. He also built phenomenal structures like this building. This is the Sacred Heart Academy, which is again now gone. It was formerly on the Catholic Block. It was demolished in 1979. I think this building, if the proposition came up to demolish it today, it would not happen. Why is that? Because we now have a historic preservation in this movement, a grassroots movement that says these buildings are not only important structures, great monuments, impressive works of art, but they also house and they hold in their very fabric 100 years of history, of stories. This building would not be torn down today if this came up. But in 1979, it was a different era. And thank goodness that this building, the Carnegie Library, was also not torn down prior to the museum moving in. So hats off to those people who have really worked hard to maintain these remarkable structures. By the late 1890s, that is the period right before the building of this library, Gibson was a big man about town. And so I'm showing you an image that came from the Missoulian, and it shows Missoula city officials in the 1890s. And I just want to point out a couple of these people. That's Gibson, the second one on the lower right, and immediately above him is Thomas Greenough. And of course, you must have heard about Thomas Greenough, one of the big barons in Missoula at the time. A.J. Gibson was politically active. He wasn't just involved in building up the city, he was also involved in its politics, and he was an alderman, served as an alderman for a number of years. The individual in the very top row in the middle is Sid Coffey, who was also an important businessman in Missoula at the turn of the last century, Gibson designed an enormous house for coffee, which I think is still going for close to $1 million today in the University District. I'll tell you where it is after the lecture if you care to know, if you're interested. Anyway. This was the most impressive home that Gibson designed in this period, and that was, of course, the Greenough Mansion. Sadly enough, a house that's gone now. This house was in the lower Rattlesnake. It was moved when the highway, the interstate, was built. And of course, as many of you know the history of the Rattlesnake, this was, in fact, the house that put A.J. Gibson on the map, so to speak, in terms of how he could build confidently in this Queen Anne style, this Victorian, favorite Victorian style of the era. And there you see the Greenoughs, Mr. and Mrs. Greenough, in the house that they were so proud of. That house, sadly enough, was cut in half, was moved to the South Hills, and then just before, after a phenomenal refurbishing, it burned to the ground. So we lost that wonderful building. But here are some of the other structures that Gibson built. Many of these houses, you'll find them on the south side. Now, when I'm talking south side, I'm not talking South Hills. Okay, the south side in Missoula was the neighborhood, the new neighborhood that developed among the nouveau riche of Missoula at the turn of the last century. And that neighborhood was immediately south of the river. Prior to the to the 1890s, Missoula really was a town that was north of the river. Well, it moved into the south, and Gibson and his friends and his colleagues, in fact, built that neighborhood that we now call the historic South Side. And these are some of the homes that you can find there on the South Side built by Gibson. Most of these houses are designed in the Queen Anne style, which was the favorite style, with a lot of that gingerbread and the bric-a-brac and the colorful brickwork that we identify with that period. And Gibson, in some ways, taught himself these architectural languages that from the East and from the central parts of the states, and brought that language to Missoula as Missoula grew and boomed in the 1890s and at the turn of the century. This is a home that, again, is no longer here, but this house stood on Broadway. This was Morris Schlossberg's home, and this house was built the same time that the Carnegie Library. I wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of things that he was building at the time that he built the Carnegie Library. The drawing that you see there on the lower right is Gibson's drawing for this, which is currently in the archives, the K. Ross Toole archives at the Mansfield Library. But you can see the kind of the grandeur of Gibson's vision. Even when he was making the transition from one architectural style, from the Queen Anne style to this neoclassical or neo-federalist style, he was in fact thinking big and as grand as possible. And when when you have patrons who can afford this, then of course the architect could do great things. But again, look at this and remember that this is a man with a 6th grade education. This house is one of our neighbors in this neighborhood. This is, of course, the home of Joseph M. Dixon, and that's just down the street here on Pine, on East Pine. And this is also a building that is contemporary with the Carnegie Library. So there you see a house that was probably much more humble originally when it was built by Dixon for his bride in 1895. We don't know who designed the original house, but when Gibson expanded it, look at how that house grew. It grew this phenomenal sort of Corinthian porch, a sort of temple entrance. And of course, Dixon's career as a lawyer had also risen meteorically in Missoula. Eventually, he became a prominent governor and statesman. The house was also fiddled with later in 1912 by Ole Bakke, who was A.J. Gibson's successor. And that's the end of the first piece. And then I'm going to shift over to discuss the Carnegie Library and then read to you some comments on the history of this library first before we actually discuss Gibson's architecture. And it's going to take a little bit for this second half of the lecture to boot up. So we'll just wait patiently, and I will go ahead and begin to read my prepared comments about. Oh, actually, it's a lot faster than I thought. It must be all that new high-tech wiring in this building. We're in the 21st century. God, I remember dropping carousels of slides on this floor in the old days. Okay, so the power of PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay. These are, it's a reproduction of a postcard of some of the buildings that you may recognize because many of them are still here in town. And many of these buildings were designed by Gibson, not all of them. The famous Babs apartment there on the left was the Missoula College, Commercial College, I can't remember exactly, Garden City Commercial College, that was the name of it. Sacred Heart there in the middle, Hawthorne School, no, that's Lowell School on the right. And then, of course, and down in the middle is the image of the University of Montana campus. And Gibson, of course, is responsible for the first 5 buildings and possibly the plan of the University of Montana campus. So that really was his acknowledged masterpiece at the end of the 19th century before doing this building. And then a later building, the Hellgate High School, or Central School as it was known then, and there you see Gibson's building in the center. The other buildings that you see on the left and right, those lower 4 buildings on the left and the right were not Gibson's. Okay, and here is in fact Missoula's, or Gibson's Missoula at the time of this building, at the time the building went up. You can see the town was really north of the river, and then all of the neighborhoods that you see developing here on the south side were brand new neighborhoods, and of course this is where Gibson himself established, and the majority of the houses that he built are east of the slant streets that you see there in that little box in the lower center of that map. Gibson, by the way, built nothing in the slant streets. I think he was politically allied to the people who would like to obliterate the slant streets. So most of his construction is north of there and east of there. And this is, of course, his great masterpiece from the end of the 19th century, from 1897 till about 1908, till he ended his career, the University of Montana campus. Notice how there's nothing between the campus and the city. It's a remarkable photograph. I think Maud took this from atop Mount Sentinel. There is Main Hall, or University Hall, on the right, the gymnasium on the far right, the science building in the lower center, the women's building in the lower left, and of course the women's building is now the math building, and then the building that you see there right to the left of Main Hall is currently Jeanette Rankin Hall. That was originally the library, and we'll talk about that building shortly. This is, of course, Gibson at his apogee as an architect. The University Hall, or Main Hall on the campus, the most stunning building in Gibson's early career in this neo-Romanesque style, like a little castle for knowledge and learning and administrating, which is what mostly happens there, we think. Okay. And now to talk about the Carnegie Library. So in 1903, Gibson designed a public library for Missoula, and this was the second major project, and that is after the university buildings, and I think one of his very best buildings. Like the university buildings, the library revealed Gibson's capacity to address the specific needs of his clients in a highly visible and public project. But it also signaled a turn in Gibson's career, and that's why the Carnegie Library is so important. For not only did he continue to express a kind of pragmatic notion of design, but he also chose a grand language. He enthusiastically embraced a new architectural language, and that language is the language of neoclassicism for a public building. Since 1875, various efforts to establish a library had been initiated in Missoula, and by the turn of the century, the library had a sizable collection of books, recently cataloged by its staff. A mill levy was passed by public vote in 1898, and it provided the library with $900 of annual income. However, the library was located in cramped quarters in a building known as the Allen Block downtown, and there was a great deal of public interest right before 1900 for the construction of a new building. So the library board decided to petition steel manufacturer and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie for funds to construct a permanent home for its library. And in 1902, Carnegie agreed and offered $12,500 toward the project. So those of you fundraisers, Just do a little comparison here. $12,500. Still, that was a great deal of money in 1902. And the condition was that the city had to provide a suitable site within 30 days for the location of this library and commit to an annual $1,250, that is 10% of the construction cost, for the upkeep and maintenance of the library, the institution. Now, think about that. We have such a hard time when we do fundraising campaigns. We can get money for bricks and mortar, but try to get a penny for maintenance beyond the cutting of the ribbon. And Carnegie had the foresight to force the city of Missoula, if he was going to give his $12,500, the city to ante up and put in its share. And that was $1,250 per year for the support of the library. In January of the following year, that is 1903, the city accepted Carnegie's offer, and a fierce competition for the site ensued. Of course, they had 30 days to pick the site. And of course, nothing has changed in this town in 100 years. Eventually, this location, that is the southwest corner of Patty and Spruce Streets, was selected, but not before an enormous public debate. One newspaper man writing for the Missoulian wrote that the library site had a butterfly life. And you thought I was being a neo-hippie with this title of this lecture. That is actually a Missoulian editor describing this, a butterfly life. And that could be taken as a positive or a negative if you think about it. Banker and building commission member J.H.T. Ryman favored this site, and that's probably why we're here. This parcel of land had been purchased for $15,000 by the city council from J.M. and Hattie Keith a few years earlier. But others wanted the courthouse square. That is a couple blocks over, right? And now you have to imagine, Gibson's courthouse wasn't there at this time. In fact, there was a small red brick building that was already, ready for the wrecking ball. So the courthouse square, the city block in the heart of the city, seemed like a logical place. However, and again, nothing has changed in 100 years, Missoula County residents would not suffer Missoula, the city's library, on their land. So they nixed that idea. Neighborhoods such as the Rattlesnake weighed in on its own behalf. The Southside neighborhood across the river, the progressive Nouveau Riche neighborhood, wanted the library down there, and they had big bucks behind their site. Mrs. Margaret Daly was willing to give up land on Higgins Avenue for the library. And that community, and of course you know who Margaret Daly was, right? The widow of the Copper King. So she not only had money for land, she also had money for the library. So the Southside neighborhood had an in on that location. Another newspaper man wrote sarcastically that if any location other than the Southside were chosen, the South will secede. The people are not loyal to the United States of Missoula, quote, unquote. At times, the arguments got so acrimonious that the debate was likened to the Civil War. Listen to this reporter. If Carnegie came to Missoula, he might remind the people that there is no north, no south, no east, no west Missoula. That without the hub of the wheel, there would be no spokes, no fellows. Then he might say that we should do the rational act of coming together. Wow. He must be like Mayor Engen reincarnated or something. I don't know. However, these were the words of the editor of the Missoulian. However, the Missoulian itself abetted this fire because the Missoulian side had opted with an east side location. Anyway, by March of 1903, this downtown location had been selected, and the library board hired A.J. Gibson to design the building not long after. Gibson, of course, had done many public buildings, but by 1903, he'd never designed a library. However, he had allies on the library board and the building commission. For example, Henry C. Stiff, a member of the commission, Gibson had just built a house for him. Attorney John M. Evans, a member of the board, Gibson had just built a house for him on the south side. And the library building then indeed had a butterfly life, because after so much acrimony, when this building opened in 1903, it opened to universal love and fanfare. The town embraced it and loved it, and they thought it was a phenomenal success. And then in 1913, the second story of the building that you see there was added by Gibson's successor, Ole Bakke. Of course, Gibson had been retired for 5 years at the time that that was added. And by the way, even though we have looked at these buildings as an organic entity, you have to remember this is two building campaigns at the outset. We have Gibson's building and we have Baki's addition in 1913. And by the way, that addition is in a different style from the original building. It's in a mission, an arts and crafts style. So the building already has, prior to this addition, the one we just built, has a history of growing additions in varying styles. This is what Gibson's building looked like originally in the lower left. That's the original building. The plans have not survived, but it's clear from these early photographs and the descriptions of the library in the papers that it was a rectangularly shaped one-story building with a full basement. It stood on a rough-faced granite foundation and wood joists sitting on the ground. The walls were made of buff gray brick with gray mortar up to a terracotta water table, and then followed by red bricks, red mortar for the first floor, and an entablature made of buff gray brick, and then a painted galvanized metal raking cornice up on top. This was Gibson's first full use of polychromy in a neoclassical building. And polychromy is an art historical term for varying colors. So if you look at this building, and I think now as you enter the new building and you walk up the building, you can now appreciate what Gibson was doing in terms of this varying colors. As you look at this window over here to your right, make sure as you exit the building or as you next time you come in, look at that wall and see how colorful it is from the ground all the way up to the roof. We often walk past this building without appreciating the integrity of its architectural design. But anyway, that polychromy, that sense of colorfulness, added a kind of joyous air to what was otherwise a very somber, ponderous, neoclassical structure. I mean, look at that great staircase and those great monolithic columns, right? The whole point was to impress you by the temple of knowledge, right? And yet the building had color. It was originally intended to be a festive, joyous place, a place where one can enjoy the life of the mind. Gibson obviously didn't perceive it as something to be dreaded. So there was the building, and with its grand entry, with its Doric columns and its great portico opening onto the sidewalk. And it was, of course, in 1903, a very inviting building in Missoula's downtown. And there's, of course, the lobby. And he took that theme of those Doric columns from the exterior and then paired them up inside the building, in the lobby, in the entrance hall of the building. Each corner of this open room, and this is, by the way, where you're sitting. In fact, this is an element that was retained from that original design. The beam ceiling, notice how it carries this new ceiling carries the design of the original ceiling that you see up there. To the left and right of the entry hall were two large reading rooms, one for children and the other for adults. And you can see that in that photo on the upper right. There's one of the reading rooms. These rooms had tall ceilings, 4 large double-hung windows with transoms for maximum illumination, and fireplaces of pressed brick with oak mantels located in the corners. Those, of course, are now gone. And the historic preservation community in some ways was troubled by the idea that we were going to lose these windows. You can see those windows on the exterior of the building. Those buildings were put there for a purpose originally, and that was to allow maximum light into a reading room. Of course, in a modern museum, you don't want maximum sunlight through one pane glazed glass. So again, the present and the future has had to compromise with the past. But so those windows aren't there. But as you can see, we've retained them on the exterior of the building, and in some ways acknowledged that these 2 reading rooms once had these very large windows by keeping this one over here on your far right. Okay, and then there was the semicircular librarian's desk in the back and the stacks behind that. There were also stacks in the basement and other storage furnace rooms located downstairs below the vestibule that was here once where you're sitting. The building was monumental but not overpowering, and Gibson tried very hard to harmonize utility with neoclassical values, that is symmetry, proportion, balance, grace. And in addition to mastering this new architectural style, he demonstrated a kind of understated yet dramatic sensibility. And again, I want to point to you to the polychromy of that facade and to the windows. And here is, in fact, Baki's drawing of his addition on Gibson's first story. And look at those little windows, because those are neoclassical in spirit only. That is, what you see there with those funny sort of rays coming off the support for the window, that's Gibson's own creative sensibility here. And it's one of sort of his hallmarks. There you see a building, a photo pre-restoration of the Carnegie Library with that wonderful sort of display of, like, almost as if there were eyes sort of opening up in these windows. And you see how he used that motif in other contemporary buildings or later buildings. That's the math building on the lower left at the university, Women's Hall, and you see that motif there in the brickwork, and you see it in Hellgate High School or Central School as well. A kind of showiness, a kind of, Gibson wasn't simply borrowing neoclassicism and replicating it, he was playing with it and enjoying it in a kind of mannerist sort of way. And then, of course, since we don't have the original plans for Gibson's building, I do invite you to visit the Jeanette Rankin Hall at the university, where you will have, in some ways, a building that followed Gibson. It's a much larger building than Gibson's Carnegie Library, but it's a building that's worth sort of visiting so that you have a sense of what Gibson envisioned in that original building that stood here in 1903, which Baki altered substantially in 1913. Okay. So, and on this note, let me backtrack here for a second and talk about the classic Carnegie plan. Some have argued that Gibson followed the classic Carnegie plan, but that's false, because no such plan existed in 1903. The Missoula Library was the brainchild of A.J. Gibson and the Building Commission alone. That is not to say that the architect and the library staff were not impressed or inspired by other neoclassical buildings, that they may have visited Carnegie libraries, that they may have seen other plans, other designs for libraries, but the credit for this design does not go to Andrew Carnegie's team in the Carnegie plan. The credit for this design belongs to A.J. Gibson and the local library planners. It can be argued that this library then becomes a template for the ideal Carnegie plan, for the ideal Carnegie Library. And that's what I think has been most exciting about doing this research, because the chronology doesn't add up. Gibson designs this building in 1913. The Carnegie plan comes into fruition in 1911. So this building preceded the Carnegie plan by many, many years. And in fact, I would argue that knowing how that Carnegie plan came into being, that this library became a model library for the Carnegie plan. Carnegie described this, the building campaign in 1903 as his wholesale period of library construction. He tended to offer many small grants between $5,000 and $50,000 to local efforts, and this process continued until his death in 1919. This were to small towns in mid-sized cities. Standardization of his plans for the hundreds of Carnegie libraries that were built across the country never really happened, much to the chagrin of James Bertram, that is Carnegie's feisty Scottish secretary, the man who was most directly in charge of corresponding with local bodies and watching these buildings being built. In 1908, 5 years after the inauguration of Missoula's library, Bertram began serious efforts to review all the plans of the Carnegie libraries, and he was looking specifically for, quote, abuses and excesses. His aim was to arrest the spate of poor, and again, this is a quotation, of poor and uneconomical buildings characterized by elaborate exteriors and inefficient interiors. Okay? He had little respect for the so-called temples erected in Carnegie's name, buildings that he considered inefficient and poor in taste, that is, exceedingly gaudy. Okay? So my interest in doing this research was to see, in fact, how did Bertram look upon our library? How did it square with the bad libraries? And how did, in fact, square with the good ones? How did Carnegie, in fact, perceive Gibson's plan? It is notable how closely the ideal library for small towns to mid-sized cities, presented by Bertram in his Notes on the Erection of a Library Building, and this was published in 1911, how closely the ideal plan mirrors A.J. Gibson's design for the Carnegie Library in Missoula. Bertram called in that book for a dignified exterior, a rectangular-shaped building with a basement and a first floor, 12 to 15-foot high ceilings, generous space for the book stacks, a circulation desk close to the entrance, a compact entryway and delivery area, well-lit reading rooms for adults and children, and a lecture hall and services located in the basement. Most of this is what Gibson gave Missoula in 1903. Bertram reproduced a floor plan that almost mirrored Gibson's plan exactly, and I find that remarkable. Bertram did find minor faults with Gibson's building, and this only becomes apparent in 1912 in the correspondence with Ryman about the adding an addition. And here's a quotation from Bertram to Ryman. "Your open hearts take up a lot of room. If the circles on the plan represent pillars, they tend to reduce the size of the reading rooms and expand the area of mere hall space." Bertram would have liked to dispense with the columns that you see around you because they were unnecessary, right? They were gaudy, pretentious, whatever. Anyway, these are minor things, but it's clear that Bertram had little patience for creature comforts. I mean, his idea of reading in a library was sitting in a very hard chair in a cold room, right? And he clearly disliked ornamental columns. But that's really all he had to complain about in Gibson's design for this building. And the changes, by the way, were never made when the addition was built. When the second floor was added to this building, they kept the fireplaces and they kept the columns. And that's because Missoulians love their creature comforts, and we have taste, for heaven's sakes. Okay, so I have no doubt that if Bertram visited Gibson's library, he would have been pleased. He would have found this building, the original building of 1903, a model of utility and good taste. And again, this library was modeled, was mimicked by others around the state and others around the country, and it was, in fact, a very important building in Gibson's entire opus. So that, in some ways, is the history, in a nutshell, of the Carnegie Library and Gibson's engagement to it. Again, the addition that you see on the second story was built by Ole Bakke, who succeeded Gibson in 1908 when he retired from the practice. It was an addition that was very successful because it created offices for the library, which they didn't have, and the spaces that you all know and love that used to be upstairs. It was, in fact, a successful addition in its time, and I think that the latest edition will, in fact, be also a marvelous, functional, in terms of utility, but also graceful addition to Gibson's original building. And then, lastly, I want to show you that Gibson's career from this moment on, turned decisively towards neoclassical architecture, towards, in some ways, bombastic neoclassical architecture. And, who do you blame here, the architect or the people who lived in these homes? But clearly, these are two homes, one in Stevensville, which is still there, and it's now on the National Register, the Bass Mansion, the Dudley C. Bass residence, and then down below, the Gustav F. Peterson residence, which is now located in a strange location, but nevertheless, the building is still intact, thank goodness. It's down below the South Hills. It's called the Gibson Mansion, although it should probably be called the Peterson Mansion more appropriately, because it was built in 1904, the year after the Gibson Library. But as you can see, obviously, from this commission led to other great commissions for Gibson, both private and public. And of course, the two greatest buildings of his career one was a private home and one was a public monument. The private home is the Daley Mansion down near Hamilton, which is today still the largest house in the state of Montana. If you haven't seen it, you should go see it, because Gibson designed that building in its definitive form. And the other great building is the courthouse, and more to come in the sequel on that building. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes?
He designed or built the Rankin home, or did John?
He did not design the Rankin home, which is, of course, gone now as well. Any other questions?
Are
Yes.
these the original door columns, and what are they made of?
These are the original columns. I think they're made of wood, right? They are the original. I think the location is a little off, right? They've been sort of, no? Or are they exactly?
Returned to the 1903.
That's right, because these columns, by the way, were originally here in 1903. When Bakke built the new entrance to the building and added the second story and put in that staircase that you all remember, these columns were moved. So they're now back to the original location.
And the ceiling.
And also, and the other interesting thing is that this wasn't here. The skylight was originally there in 1903. When Bakke altered the building in 1913, that was filled in. The skylight was removed so that the second story could go on there, and the staircase then filled in that gap. Well, the architect here has in fact evoked that original skylight by bringing us that little oculus, that little opening there.
Is that architect in this room right now?
I don't know, is Warren
I think he
around?
is here today. No,
He is not here.
that's Warren Hampton with Oz.
You know who built that building just on south of Higgins, the Paxton building? That has all the like feed store, youth sports exchange, and the 2 levels of apartments.
On South Higgins, on the west side of the street. The first building there, the Montaigne building, as it's called today, is a Gibson building. The next tiny little store where Frida Picasso's
Yeah.
is or used to be or whatever, that's a Gibson building. And then the rest of that row is not a Gibson building. That row once ended with a gas station that Gibson once owned that he designed, but that's gone. But immediately behind that, the Babs is Gibson's.
Do you know the original intent of that first chunk?
You mean the building on the corner?
Yeah, with
The
all
Montaigne building?
apartments. Did it house workers or people? Or?
Yeah, that building, it was originally called the Penwell Block, and it was built, it's the first major building to be built on the south of the river on Higgins Avenue. Does everybody know which building I'm talking about? As you're driving south on Higgins, it's the first building you see above the train station on the right. It's a very large block. That building was designed with that train station in mind. So it had a hotel in it, it had an ice cream parlor, it had a drugstore. It was designed to cater to the people coming off the train, which opened in the train, that line came through in 1910. The building opened in 1909. So again, there's Gibson thinking, or Penwell thinking speculatively, you know, the bridge is coming, the train is coming, money is flowing. So, yeah.
Since he was self-trained, do you have a good example of one of his failures?
Oh, he's dead now, so I can say this, right? Actually, since you've seen it, I can talk a little bit about a building that I don't think is a very successful building, and that's Gibson's own home. Gibson's house on the south side on South 2nd Street, and it's still there. It has a plaque, a National Register plaque, and it's now, I think, something like 5 apartments. But that house began as a very humble, very simple Queen Anne style, as simple as it could possibly be. Gibson then added an addition as the family grew when the baby came along. Then eventually in 1915, after he retired, he gave Maud the kind of big, showy craftsman style house that she wanted. And actually, I think he was interested in the craftsman style after his retirement, so he wanted to build one thing. That house makes no sense whatsoever. If you walk through that space, you go through small Queen Anne style rooms with pocket window or pocket doors and all this fussy ornamental woodwork, lattice work between rooms and built-in hutches and cupboards. And you go into the next room and you think Frank Lloyd Wright had just arrived, cleaned it all out, put in nice straight oak boards. The posts are just very rectilinear things, supporting the space, dividing the rooms. The house doesn't flow. It's in fact a mishmash. But it was built in different generations, very varying styles. And in some ways, maybe that's where Gibson's lack of education is visible, because he wasn't appreciating the space as an entire volume. He was appreciating it as a series of additions in new styles. Does that make sense? Other questions? I'm sorry, AJ, wherever you are. Yes.
It sounded like his career ended suddenly.
Yes.
What was the sudden?
That's the next lecture. No, A.J. Gibson's relationship to the courthouse, to the Missoula County Courthouse, is a very, very complex chapter in the story. That courtyard has been described as the zenith of his career. I consider it the nadir of his career. It is the lowest moment in his career. It in some ways forced him to retire. And if you think this project was controversial, wait till you hear about the courthouse project. I think it's the project that broke his spirit in terms of building. It is ironically his greatest building, and it is ironically, celebrated today as the most beautiful of his constructions. But it was really the most troubled project for him, and he retired in a cloud of controversy around the design and the construction of that building, and the politics around that building were thick. You think it's bad here now? Wait till you hear about that courthouse building. Well, the building will celebrate its centennial. It was supposed to, if you go to the building today, you'll see that over the doorway it says 1908. It actually opened in 1910. Gibson retired in 1908. So in 1910, we'll be celebrating its 100th anniversary. At that point, I'll give you the lecture on the dome. One more question. Anybody? Okay, adios. Enjoy. Oh, well, yeah.
I remember reading something as this building got going, how there was a celebration about how the addition matched the feeling and color and texture of the original building. And then I came by and walked at it and went, okay, well, I see that one little line that matches the whole thing, but it doesn't. I mean, they're like two completely different eras. It's like, where did that come from? I mean, where did that statement come from? It was built as far as I'm concerned, but where did that statement come from in comparison to what you see?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that there's 100 years of architectural history between Gibson's building in 1903 and the building that we just added currently. So in some ways, there was no attempt to match the original building. There was no attempt to create something that was a falsification of the original building or an imitation of the original building. We wanted a building, and I think everyone here wanted a building that was a modern building, a building of its time that belonged to the early 21st century, not a building that belonged to 1903 or 1913. By the way, we couldn't build the buildings that Gibson built in 1903 or 1913. They wouldn't hold up. They wouldn't pass muster today. We needed a contemporary building that suited our time. But the design of that building also had to be of this age as well. It couldn't simply be something that would mislead people into thinking that it was in fact a building built 100 years ago. So the other thing, of course, this is no longer a library. This is now an art museum. And we wanted a building that spoke art, that spoke of the function of an art museum rather than the function of an archaic library. So there was no attempt to imitate or to depend on architecture that was crafted 100 years ago. That said, if you look at these buildings carefully enough, you will see that that new wing has the kind of polychromy, the kind of joyous polychromy with the materials of our time that Gibson had 100 years ago. If you look at these buildings conceptually, in terms of the use of space, in terms of the volumes, you'll notice that these buildings flow into each other. So there is a dialogue here, a correspondence between the contemporary spaces and the old spaces. The skin of the building it doesn't match it in materials. It's not the same stone or the same brickwork or the same tan water table or whatever. No, there was no attempt to imitate those materials. There was an attempt to bring new materials in the same way that Bakke brought in new materials. Bakke added stucco to this building. To a brick and stone building, Bakke added stucco. Think how that must have gone over. Okay? So there was no attempt to, in fact, mimic the architecture of 100 years ago. The attempt was, in fact, to bring in new materials, but to use the design ideas of this building as the springboard and to talk to the original design. And I think that's what these buildings are doing to each other. We're talking across a 100-year divide in looking at these two buildings. I can't wait to bring my first batch of architectural students out here to talk precisely about the merits, the flaws, the potential problems of doing something like this. But again, the other thing you have to do is compare this building. This is sort of a Fidel Castro line. Don't compare us to the first world. Compare us to our comparables, right? Look at other additions around this town and think about how they relate to the original buildings. For example, Gibson's courthouse. Or go over to the old library, which is now social sciences at the University of Montana. You have plenty of examples of what shouldn't be done when you add an addition to a building. I don't think this is one that falls into that camp. Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy this place. Come back.
Thank you, Rafael.